Hi, everyone. This is Jeremy Schiefling from Khan Academy. Thank you so much for joining us today for an amazing session led by one of our rockstar ambassadors, Varghese Alexander. So for those who don't know, Varghese has been teaching math for 17 years and is currently the Assistant Dean of Faculty at the Asheville School, as well as co-director of the Klingenstein Summer Institute at Teachers College at Columbia. So definitely spent a lot of his career thinking about big, hairy questions in the education space, none more complex than that of assessment. And so what he's going to share with you over the next 20 minutes is going to be highly actionable. We know we're all in this really difficult moment right now. What can you do now and into the future to make your assessment even more effective? Now, before we get to that, two important notes. Number one, the session will absolutely be recorded and sent out via email in about an hour. So if you have to leave for any reason, or if you want to share with a colleague, please do so. And then number two, as with any good educator, Varghese is going to make this session really interactive. So there are going to be a bunch of live polls throughout. Feel free to participate as we go through. And then also, most importantly, ask questions. If you've got ideas on your mind, if you want to challenge some of the things that Varghese shares, feel free to do that in the questions tab. We'll be happy to respond to those at the end of the session. So without further ado, please put your virtual hands together for Varghese Alexander, our awesome presenter today.
Thanks, Jeremy. I want to start first by saying that the 7 years of practice is not me trying to hide my true age. I've been teaching for 17, but instead it refers to the past 6 or so years that I transitioned into using Khan Academy as my textbook. It also includes last spring, when I quickly learned what asynchronous remote learning actually was. This summer, as I listened to webinars and I prepped for teaching this year, I designed for online with a hope to test my ideas out in person. And luckily for us, we've been able to do that. All right, so here's some fun facts that are lost in Zooms, and also the fact that I'm not on video right now. I'm actually 6'7", so I've got 2 tall daughters, and I also have a wonderful partner who's in education as well. I've been teaching at boarding schools for the entirety of my career, and for the past 8 summers, I've worked with early career teachers, that's between their 2nd and 5th year, through the Klingenstein Summer Institute, run out at Teachers College and Columbia University. Needless to say, I geek out over pedagogy and intentionality in the classroom. I spend my summers working on it and evenings debating practice with my wife. So let's start here with a mess of courses I've noticed at a number of schools currently. And we're still adhering to that, even though these are sort of the same courses that I had 25 years ago in high school. This second image is our evolution here at Asheville School. We created a 4-year progression which led directly to AP statistics, in addition to the more traditional filter of calculus courses. I was pretty proud of where our school went with this program, but now I realize that it might not be enough. And so I want to start first with a couple of priming questions. How many hours on average a week do you spend grading? And I want you to hold on to that. Feel free to share it in the chat or in the poll. And your feelings towards your energy spent there can be included in the chat. We'll circle back to the...
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to have the result right now? Because we're getting about 50 or 60 votes immediately, but we can definitely come back to it if you want as well.
Great. No, let's see what we got.
Okay, so we'll do a little countdown here for those who are still voting. We're more than halfway there. Let's do 5 more seconds. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We'll close the poll. We'll share the results. And it looks like 3 to 5 is the leading contender so far.
3 to 5 is actually is great, and I found myself on both sides of that spectrum. Right, some weeks are a little bit lighter, but most weeks actually I fell into that 5 to 10 hours. And in all that I do, I think efficiency is big for me. But we're going to come back to these hours spent grading and the purpose behind grading. Here's my second question. And this is a quick check of your students' current grades. And I've got a strange distribution here, and I hope it falls for many of us. Mostly A's, along with the typical distribution that with the occasional outlier. A lot of B's along a bell-shaped distribution. C would be even number of A's, B's, and C's. D's are a barbell of A's and C's. Again, all of these questions, these first 3 questions, are really just to place you in the conversation and allow for a quick point of reflection. So Jeremy, how's that poll going?
Yeah, so we're already up to 20%. Thanks for all those fast fingers. Definitely some future Jeopardy contestants on the line here. I wanted to read a quote from Mary Lou Candigan, who said, "I dislike grading. I'd rather spend my time coming up with engaging lessons and great resources." So some interesting context as we dive into this discussion today.
Yeah, Mary Lou, I hope I'm going to be able to help answer that a little bit too, or at least show you what I've been doing.
Okay, so we'll close the poll in about 3 seconds. Got about 60% participation. And here are those results. And it's actually a really sort of competitive race, so to speak. Any thoughts there, Varghese, in terms of what you're seeing?
I mean, it's kind of a really neat distribution. We've got 24% at that A range, 21% with the bell-shaped, and then an even split. I'm curious to know what other looks like. And I know that there have been years for me where I fell into that barbell with a lot of students doing really well and a number of students doing poorly with those C's. Again, this is a reflective approach as I come and give you some more ideas. And here's my third question in my trio. Your end of year grades. I like playing with probabilities, and one of the purposes for math that I extol to my students is this idea of predicting the future. So this isn't a trick question. Again, it's more reflective and to help you think about your practice as a whole. Kudos to some of you who refuse to assume how your students will perform in the future. But, and if you can really do that, I want to be there for that presentation that you present. Honestly, I've been doing this for so long that I feel like I am swayed by a lot of their early work. And for us, that means a little bit over a trimester. But where do you think your students will fall with end of year grades?
Okay, so as that comes in, I want to speak to your last question about the other. Christine says, my barbell is more A's and then D's and F's. Joe says, I've got a lot of C's, D's, and F's. And then Mary Lou says, I have mostly A's because I teach AP stats and the kids are pretty motivated. I have a few who do poorly, but I wouldn't call it a barbell.
Gotcha. No, the C's, D's, and F's, that's a hard year. And I hope that some of the ideas that I give you might help shake some of that. Moving to a mastery-based unit has helped me quite a bit with struggling students, especially with a high rate of struggling students.
Yeah, I will add in a little bit of interesting context. The district here in California where Khan Academy is based just released stats that the number of Fs given out to high school students this year are up 170% over last year. So I wonder if Joe's results are more COVID related than anything, or if that's just his normal distribution.
That's devastating. I mean, yeah, the fact that California's results are like that it makes sense in many ways, right? How are we going to get content to students? But at the same time, how disheartening for so many of our students.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm about to share these results to get your final votes in. I will say that Catherine's putting out a good point, which is C is not a poor grade in my book. And that speaks to that sort of inflationary thing that American education has experienced recently. I don't know if you have any thoughts there, Varghese.
No, and kudos to you and your school for looking at the whole spectrum of grades. I guess to frame the rest of the presentation, as I'm shifting towards a mastery-based process, and yeah, I'll own it. I'll own it that grade inflation has impacted how I grade, but honestly, I don't think it's going to impact my understanding, right, or my students' understanding. So that's my caveat to that. But kudos to you on holding true to C's and having a class that keeps working with you.
Great. And then here are the results from the last poll. And you can see exactly like you said, Varghese, a lot of folks are assuming sort of things will stay pretty much the same.
And that's one of those things that has me thinking about big picture, right? Why are we doing all these assessments if primarily the bulk of our students are staying the same? There's a lot of stress involved in all of that. And I'm not saying that, hey, that means we should get rid of assessments altogether, but this is a great inflection point for us to sort of think about things. And that's where I am right now. And I want to start with last year. I'm not sure if all of you know about this organization, but just prior to shutting down, we were reviewing our weekly schedule and we brought in the consultant about scheduling. And for independent schools, it's called independent school management. in our multiple conversation, I was reminded about how class time is king for our faculty, and how making the most efficient use of that time was the express purpose of this fancy outside firm, right? The simplicity of their question rocked me. And if in-person class time is king, what is the purpose of having students spend a whole week on midterm exams? And then again on finals. And this is something that is maybe specific to Asheville School, but we had 2 semesters. And at the end of the semesters, we canceled class for a week and essentially had an exam per subject. And they just asked us to think about that. For me, that question translated and extended into, how does testing everyone on Tuesday play out? And you could fill in the blanks for Tuesday. But if class time is in fact king, how could I justify spending so much time, for me, again, that's roughly 1 out of 7 hours or periods, having students work independently on assessments? And I asked this because I found myself having 3 types of students primarily. And Jeremy, if you see comments that are burning, please just jump in and interrupt me. So here's my 3 students, or my 3 subsets of students. My first set of students were not ready for that assessment. And frankly, they knew they didn't understand the material. They didn't need a quiz or a test taking up instructional time to reiterate that they, in fact, knew less than 70% of the material. How was I justified in spending that class time for those students? My second group of students actually figured out the game of school quite well. They created excellent skills in cramming and keeping up. But these aren't the skills of deep learning that I actually am interested in. They're the skills of cramming and keeping up. This last subgroup is the one that I believe that we do the most harm to. These are the students that actually love assessments. I think I would have fallen into this group when I was younger. And frankly, they know they're going to crush it. They'll spend hours or moments in a test, minutes perfecting each problem because it reinforces how incredibly good they are at math. The work of Carol Dweck helped me to realize that this outcome is probably the most problematic to my students. Success in itself is not a bad thing, but the structures I use and the systems I use based on a synchronized lockstep model did not reinforce the success that I was hoping for, or even the challenge that I was hoping for. Okay, and I want to be completely transparent about this too. The rest of my ideas are clearly not my own. Shoot, every image on this slide is not my own. All of it is really just another interpretation and implementation of the ideas found in Make It Stick by Brown, Rodinger, and McDaniel. Many of you, especially those of you that arrived early, I'm assuming understand Khan Academy's course mastery system quite well. A quick summary for those of you that don't is that course mastery allows for participants or students to move through problem sets in courses and units, revealing a skills percentage based on accuracy. Students can retake exercises and assessments repeatedly in order to prove levels of proficiency. The beauty of it is that my students are finally figuring out there are many ways to get to 90%. None of these paths avoid intentional practice and cumulative understanding. I'm going to say that again. None of these paths to getting to 90% avoid intentional practice and a cumulative understanding. Without success on a unit test, they can't break 80%. My students are also beginning to understand that repetition is the key in the process of learning, and doing problems is the only way to improve that score. So 90% equaling 80% in my classroom means that once they've secured 90% on a given unit, they've already earned that B- for that unit, and they can only improve from there. I've taken a 100-point grading scale and essentially shifted it into a 20-point scale based on the material they cover. And so, yes, I have fallen into that grade inflation, but it's a little bit tweaked. And the use of Khan Academy has allowed me to reward those points that they are earning. So this gets me to my first finding, which is honoring the idea of their time and work. Now I come to the idea of curation. Khan Academy is incredibly excellent in its problem sets. But with the pacing of courses, I began to realize that I needed to stack large core units around supplemental smaller units. The core units, such as in this example of my Honors Algebra 2, are systems as a review, functions, and quadratics to start. Then I throw in supplemental units that will give all students context. But by stacking larger units with smaller units, I can emphasize those large units as my core units and allow for students to choose to complete the smaller units if they have time. The curation also involves layering SAT questions on top of the Khan problem sets to confirm transfer. These questions, if completed well, can reveal a deep understanding of the material and usually require interleaved practice of previous concepts. Okay, and I imagine if you were going to write something in the chat right now, but wait, circling back, you might bring me to the course mastery process and ask, Varghese, if given the choice, why would students choose to do more work? And that leads me to hack number 1. Student initiative dictates placement. The units they complete reveal how well versed their understanding is. You scale up this curation over the course of the year and allow students to self-prepare for the courses they're going to take. Instead of a teacher creating a single assessment that determines a student's placement at the end of the year, students will prove their success by how much material they can cover over the course of the entire year. Core units give them a general credit for the course and prepare our students for our applied approach found in our AP statistics pathway. Expanded units prepare our students for that AP calculus path. And completing all the units plus more reveals that students have the ability to make many connections on their own and are ready for our most theoretical classes. In this case, it means our BC track and multivariable. Here, finding number 2 is my favorite. Last spring, in the midst of a sudden online asynchronous class, I realized that I couldn't expect all of my students to attend class daily. So instead, I made Loom videos for every question whenever my students asked. Last spring, under a stay-at-home order, I also had the time and the ability to recommend lessons on Khan Academy to each of my students individually. What this meant was that students did not get a new set until they completed the prior set. Now, what I learned was that if I was more patient, more stubborn than the average teenager I taught, a frustrating boredom set in as the reality of seeing the same types of problem became apparent to the student. Eventually, all my students, even the ones that struggle the most, would take on the work of learning the material. This was a weird and deep understanding for me, and one that I've got to credit COVID to. This understanding probably leads to the clearest assessment hack. If I already have students earning a 90% in any given unit, then instead of creating a physical assessment with 20 questions on it over 5 pages with a bunch of staples, I could rely on Khan Academy's reports to repurpose and reuse the questions they have the most trouble with. I could do all of this and even be transparent to my students in the process. Now, my assessments are a total of 5 questions. I call them paper quizzes that take all of the front and back of a single sheet of paper. They include 3 to 4 questions the class as a whole has the most trouble with, which, interestingly, if most of the students end at 90%, that last 10% is what I need to assess the most on. And with enough of a sample size, 60 students or so in each course, I have that actual overlapping sample size so that I can pick up the hardest questions for them. And then, in addition to those 3 or 4 questions, I add an SAT question or 2 that ties everything that we've learned together thus far. Here, I'm going to bring in a specific example of assessing the friction. This lesson, Reasoning with Systems of Equations, was particularly insightful this year. In prior years, I may have let students slide because of vocal frustrations, especially if they already proved they understood elimination and substitution as ways to solve a system of equations. But this year, I noticed such a high percentage of my students getting these problems wrong. Although they understood how to solve systems, they had no idea about the importance of the properties of inequalities that was the underlying understanding, and how it was these properties that allowed them to manipulate a system algebraically. Instead of skipping over lessons like this, I now double down on them and help to deepen understanding as opposed to only honoring rote processes. On this note, I want to come back to the idea that currently drives my teaching. It's sort of my vague mission statement, if you will. Time spent grading doesn't matter if we don't create the space for processing mistakes. Now, Khan's problem sets allow for immediate feedback. And the one thing I preach is to really indulge in a mistake. Own it, give it context, make it cringy. Instead of avoiding or erasing mistakes, the students with the most humility grow the most. And again, this is really hard for my students to completely absorb. This is after years and years of using a pencil to erase mistakes. And again, I love pencils as much as the next, but if a student erases their mistake, how will I know what they're having trouble with, right? The students, but my students are, overall, my students fall into that resilient category. And that's a wonderful sort of attribute to their character. But in the context of math, this image especially forces me to remember that even though they're making it through the storm of assessments and homework and feedback, all that's happening by the end of the year is they're just literally standing and they're a little bit broken. And I fear that they're definitely not inspired to take higher level math. My new hope as a teacher is that students will reflect on mistakes, paraphrase the hints, and spend their time attacking gaps, especially because they know that I'm assessing that friction, those gaps. Okay, here's my third finding, and this was, again, particularly true last spring. Amidst the stay-at-home requests, the students that didn't make it to online sessions really did want to connect, right? And students that didn't made it to online sessions, they wanted to just talk. Luckily, our school used Office 365 and we had Microsoft Teams, but the bigger idea still remains. And I think that is to find a way outside of traditional models to connect with your students. Not every child is interested in raising their hand or asking questions, or even ready to do that yet in a classroom discussion-based context. But digital platforms help me realize there are other ways of reaching them. For me, that was the messaging feature in Teams. Also, from an efficiency standpoint, I hate email. I'm navigating so many emails a day that if I were to have to navigate a string of emails for each student, I wouldn't be able to do it. This year, what I'm expecting the students to do is connect with me weekly in order to talk about what lessons they're working on, how many minutes they hope to achieve in Khan, and also reflect on the lesson that was either most interesting or most difficult for them. The idea is to name big and small goals, right? I'll be their accountability buddy. I'll be their coach. Again, this is all a work in progress, but messaging on Microsoft Teams has been incredible, and it also consolidates a whole thread of conversations that take place over multiple months into one very accessible location for me, especially as we have to write narrative comments. Okay, and this leads to hack number 3. In all of this, it took me about 5 weeks to come up with this idea that I wanted to see all of their work over a given week at a glance. I wanted to see how much work students were producing and honor those that were willing to ask questions. A digital portfolio was my solution. And in the midst of the recent iterations of this process, I realized that students could put a whole week's worth of screenshots on one page. They could also include questions that I would help them with in person in real time. And again, when we were online, I was doing the same thing over Loom and video chats. In this manner, when I go back to grade their work, I can see concrete examples of how engaged they were in class by how many questions they put up and how many times I annotated explanations on their screenshots. In all of this, custom ranges on Khan Academy have been a godsend. And if I teach my students nothing else, they'll realize how easy and useful screenshots are in providing a paper trail. Okay, so coming back to that question and that poll earlier, it's interesting because I think prior years, I'd say, oh, I want all of my weakest students to get better. But now as I reflect, end of year success is wonderful, but what if they had continuous incremental success throughout the year? And frankly, I think that is one of the ways that we can break through math anxiety and test anxiety. This doesn't necessarily fall into those that teach at the AP level or self-select into more rigorous classes, but I'm thinking of the broad strokes and those students that have trouble. What if we created a path so that they can have success all the way through? And the other part about grading is that I hope I'm communicating my own energy in this, but this model makes success accessible for all, and therefore grading more fun. The questions and the comments and the vocabulary they use, and I require, again, another presentation, on even those shorter assessments, let me know if they have a deep understanding of the material or they just have a baseline understanding. And I think, to me, responding to a couple of key and insightful questions is way better than trying to navigate 4 or 5 pages of assessments. In this ridiculous year of disorder and chaos, I'm betting that a little more chaos with structured support will keep my students engaged and me interested. It's all a risk, but we tell our students to take risks every time they answer a question. The least I could do is model failing forward for them without harming their future prospects. It's my own meta attempt to grow anti-fragile. In all of this, I want to explain one other idea my students suggested when I presented this presentation to them. I've created a transparent model of choosing my favorite student or my favorite class. And I know we're not allowed to do that, but what if we based it on data? In order to encourage students to ask questions, I made it explicit to them that they could be my favorite by asking the most good questions. It's funny because I'm sure I started this out as a joke, just to encourage conversation. But I realize that it's true, especially at the class level. The period with the most number of students asking good questions is the one that I'm most excited to work with. You get better at whatever you practice. This is something that a mantra that I mention to my students all the time. And I hope I help students practice the creation of good questions. Built for online, but so much more fun in person. Remember that 90% online ensures 80% of their grade. 10% is built on paper quizzes that assess friction and highlight the process. And again, I want to be clear, these paper quizzes are also foreshadowed by daily worksheets we start class with each day. Excuse me. The final 10% is their body of work and confirming relational aspects of teaching. Ironically, half of it is done online through a digital portfolio, but this way I'm honest and I know that I've attempted to connect with each student each week. I know I'm pushing time a little bit, but here's some happy bonuses. First, in preparing to teach, I realized that there are excellent books and articles regarding math that were just not around 20 years ago. The Joy of X by Steven Strogatz, or Math with Bad Drawings by Ben Orlin. I just had so much fun reading about math, and I think my students appreciate that I share articles with them about pedagogy. They know that I care about this stuff. If for nothing else, for context and variety. Finally, I love my fluffy class where everyone works at their own pace and gets a good grade. But in order for them to get over both math anxiety and test anxiety, they've got to excel on an external metric. For me, the SATs are that silver bullet. Some of their math questions are excellent opportunities for transfer and deep understanding. They also reflect the idea that students get better at whatever they practice. And I can ensure that we practice the SATs. All right, so here's my final disclaimer. This is all very much in alpha testing. So I am going to include pitfalls. Number one, students new to Khan hate getting things wrong. I mean, frankly, all of us hate getting things wrong, but the immediate feedback is hard for them. The idea of losing mastery points on unit tests has students gun shy to take problems on again, but it reminds me of their lack of anti-fragility and that fixed mindset. It's an opportunity for me to help. Comparison is the thief of joy. I personally love the saying, and it comes up often in my household. Although I have not actually heard students talk much about how frustrated they are when others are ahead of them, I want to name that I assume this is a fear they have. And finally, I hate learning on the computer. I just want a textbook. Zoom, go to meetings, all these calls exhaust me too. But I call bunk on this excuse. this is an example of teenagers being teenagers. And I reassure you that 10 years ago, when I taught out of that green book, they were saying, I hate textbooks. I'll admit that I pushed them away from Khan Academy videos while we're in session. And I start every day with that paper worksheet to emphasize the problems that they got wrong and also math words. But I also have a standing bet with them that I can explain any Khan video in under 3 minutes. And I have a king size candy bar for them if I'm proven wrong. So far this year, I'm good. Okay, this is the mess that we offer so many of our students. And at this point, frankly, it almost seems convoluted just to be convoluted. What if instead of all of that, we built a system that was handed to us and promised to be free forever? I've got to believe that transparency and a clear path will help many of the students that aren't being served by the older model right now. And again, there's a lot to be said about Head Starts and privilege, but I think transparency over a number of years is our best shot at equity. I only get to do this sort of for 1 year and one snapshot, but what if we started this game plan in 6th grade or in 3rd grade? If I had my druthers, that's what I would do. I'd have kids and teachers head back to Khan kids, right? All the way back up to 1st grade and prior, and create good habits in how they look at mistakes and hopefully math. What if every elementary and middle school math teacher was given time and funding to work all the problem sets from 2nd grade through Algebra 1 on Khan Academy? That understanding of the Common Core would help an incredible number of students. So I think that you know that the 3 hacks are somewhat of a misnomer. They're my takeaways after 7 years of practice with Khan Academy as my textbook and 1 semester online. But clearly they fit into a holistic approach that's built around block scheduling, Office 365, no more midterm exams, and of course Khan Academy. I do have my druthers at home with my tall children, and my 9 and 11-year-old are on track. And although I definitely am not perfect and there are hangry shouting matches over math, overall their understanding is so much better than mine was at their age. And I have to credit that to the transparency and their growth over time. They get to see how they're improving and they want to continue that. They see those streaks and they want to improve on that. And all of that's based on the problem sets inherent to Khan Academy. As Jeremy said before, please do reach out with ideas or blind spots that you may have noticed. My Instagram and Twitter handles are both @tallmantutor. And Jeremy, I've got time for questions if anyone wants to stick around.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Varghese. On behalf of the 200 plus teachers listening across the country, that was awesome. And so we do have a bunch of questions coming in. Feel free to ask those in the questions tab, or if you want, you can even raise your hand and I'm happy to unmute your mic and you can ask live. But we'll start with some that are coming in already. So Jeff asked one that actually builds on what you were just finishing up with, which is how do you move to mastery-based learning as a 9th grade algebra teacher when my students are so weak on basic arithmetic and algebra problem sets on Khan Academy, and those problem sets assume prior knowledge? How do I make that transition?
Okay, and I don't know if you saw this when I was talking about the review. I teach an honors algebra 2 course, and I'll tell you that most of my first trimester was reviewing algebra 1 on Khan Academy, right? Systems is an algebra 1 unit. Quadratics is an algebra 1 unit. So what I would say is go back to 8th grade, go back to 7th grade, choose the units that you think are helpful. I know with my own daughter, a 6th grader, the understandings that she has of functions can rival some of my students because she's understanding the idea of input and output values from the start, as opposed to just understanding those rote values. It's going to be hard, and I would say you need a little bit of administrative support in this. But I think, and this is my bet, right? If students had 2 or 3 years with you, they're going to see phenomenal growth over time. And they're also, students are worried about teachers noticing their gaps. And if you help them fill in those gaps, they're going to be more confident about math. At least that's how I believe it.
Awesome. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put in a link in the chat to another Khan ambassador, Tim Vandenberg, who did exactly that. So he was teaching at a slightly earlier grade level, but he actually took his students all the way back to kindergarten and rebuilt those foundations step by step and helped his students totally outperform. So I will share that in the chat, but definitely a like-minded superstar teacher rethinking expectations to get big results. Martha's got a great question for you, Varghese, which is how can I get my middle school students to get over their hatred of getting one question wrong on Khan Academy? I continuously encourage them to use the hints and to understand their mistakes before they move on, but many of them want to start to try to game the system if they get one wrong. And they get the rest wrong on purpose, and they start over to get 100%. How can Martha get her students out of that mindset?
So the way to do that is by really adhering to that idea that they've got to get 90% on the unit, right? Instead of just looking at proficiency in one specific exercise, if they look at 90% on the unit, I even have some students that start off by taking the unit test twice to see where their gaps are, and then going back to the quizzes, and then going back to the exercises. It's a really hard sort of model to break, but this goes back to that idea about boredom. They've got to know that they're not moving on, and then they've got to see examples of their peers succeeding. Something that I tell them pretty frankly is don't tank, right? That idea of getting one wrong and then getting the next 4 wrong, especially if you already have some mastery points, will ruin your overall grade. And it'll especially ruin it if you're taking a unit test.
All right, so I think we might have a live question from Jane. Let me just give Jane a chance here. So again, if you want to ask a question live to Varghese, just raise your hand. Let's see here. One moment. Uh-oh, I think we lost Jane. Okay, we'll come back to her if we get her back on the line. In the meantime, great question from Mary Lou, which is, what does an actual class look like for you? You mentioned starting with a paper quiz. Do you always have different levels of quizzes available for each student? Do kids ever get a chance to collaborate?
Okay. Sadly, with COVID, the kids don't. They're all working 6 feet apart. But ideally, I'd have my students at the board. We don't start with a paper quiz. Actually, I only create 1 paper quiz per unit per week. And so some of my students are racing ahead, but having only 1 paper quiz a week allows me some breathing room to only create as it arrives and my schedule is. But B, it also means that they've got to review material, especially if they're rushing through material. Now, going back to the idea of what does a class period look like? Class starts off with a worksheet. So it doesn't actually start off with a paper quiz, but a worksheet with about 5 problems. And what I do with those problems is I look at the questions that students are having trouble with in that particular unit that I have suggested that we're doing that week, right? The timing is still there. And so I put up about 3 questions from there. I usually jump ahead and find a question from a future unit that might be able to be tangentially related to one of the questions we're working on right now. And ideally, at my best, I would also put in a 5th question that's a review, a harder review question from a problem we've done previously. So that's actually, and again, we have a 70-minute block, but I think this will work even in a 60-minute block where they've got about half the period to work on that, and I go over those problems. That's my quote-unquote lecture. But I could also walk around and check if they have an understanding and if they're using vocabulary in addition to the solutions they're providing. Now, that second half of class is actually more of sort of an office hour type thing, where that's the point at which I credit the students for asking questions. And what they do is they post their questions on OneNote. I use an iPad, and then I annotate those questions, and I do it in the order that they're working on. Again, without 6 feet apart rules, I'd prefer that they work in pairs and they're working on the board together. That's all a little moot this year, but I'm sure I'd go back to it in future years.
Awesome. Okay, so now let's try to do another one of these live ones. So I believe that Jamie actually has a question. So Jamie, I just unmuted your line. If you're there, feel free to ask the question directly to Varghese.
Hi, Varghese. How are you? Thanks for having us on today.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining.
I just had a question. So I do special ed, and I introduced Khan Academy to my students last year and kind of just barely diving into it. Now I'm one of the ambassadors, and I think I'm still trying to struggle with how should I be incorporating Khan Academy into my classroom. Obviously, up until last week, we were actually in full session with students who were remote at the same time. So I would be sitting in my classroom with my computer, working with kids who were in person on their computers also, and we would be kind of joining in Zooms together and working together. But my kids really like Khan Academy, but I don't know if I should be using that more within my class on the topic we're teaching and assigning lessons regarding my topic we're doing? Or can I be doing, like I've been assigning like go on Khan Academy for 20 minutes tonight for homework, and I want you to work on mastery, or I want you to work on the assignments I've given you. I kind of wanted your opinion on what you think of that.
Okay, so with differentiated instruction, it depends on how wide your group of students is, right? But I guess what I would say is my ideal would be that my students work a mastery every other day. And so having your students return to mastery will interleave the practice questions. And I think that's excellent. If you can get that habit in, that's a huge step, because then in class, you can do the problem sets together, right? I would leave mastery and those quizzes for practice at home.
Okay, mastering quizzes at home, and then the assignments for just when they're working within class.
Working within class. But the other big step that I did this year was I showed them the rest of the unit progression, right? So although I use Khan Academy's units, remember that stacking idea means that I curate just a little bit and I tell them which units are going to go in which order. So those students that are excelling and really appreciate it, I have them going ahead on their own.
Okay. Like for my students, like I've only got like, at any point 3 or 4 students in my class, right?
Okay.
But they're at varying levels. For instance, I've got 5th and 7th grade in my class. My 7th grader is probably functioning at like a 2nd or 3rd grade level, and my 5th graders are probably functioning at about a 3rd grade level. So, like last year we were working on a lot of place value and stuff like that. So I kind of started them off on place value because they were kind of familiar with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No,
so,
absolutely.
That's kind of where I was kind of diving into lessons of stuff, skill sets that I know they have been introduced to that they could work more on, but I'm also challenging them, and putting them into different grade levels to try different things just so they have that, sitting at home rather than playing a video game, go and learn something new,
No, and that's what I said. Absolutely. And this is what I tell parents too, right? I have colleagues that are parents of our younger children, and I cut this out of the presentation, but if you want to improve your reading level, you don't only read things that are harder than your current reading level, right? You actually, 90% of your reading should be below grade level just so you get comfortable with it. And I imagine that the analogy holds for math. I think what you want to do really is support those students at lower grade levels and let them keep on tweaking their understanding until they have mastery. Once they have mastery, they're going to be pretty excited to do well on those course challenges or even those unit tests. And so
Okay.
I would say err on lighter stuff. And then as you have a student that starts accelerating, then you sort of throw them some carrots ahead and see if they can take it on.
And I remember I signed up my kids for mastery at the level that I thought they were, not at the level they were actually in grade level.
So, and I'll say this out loud, and Jeremy, you can push back on this. The course mastery is wonderful for some students, but it's really intimidating for others, right? Seeing that they're only improving incrementally and they have gaps to fill, it's really hard for them. It'd be amazing if we had unit mastery that popped up first on that splash page. So, so that's a request that I put into the chat line or the features a couple times.
Yeah, because initially I put in like they're in 7th grade, and then suddenly I get the mastery stuff. I'm like, whoa, time out. And I remember contacting Khan and going, fix that for me. I don't want them at 7th grade level,
So I would, of course, as we mentioned a couple of times, I would err on much lighter until they get excited, and until they get excited about it being okay to make mistakes, right? It's a lot like weightlifting. You want form over quantity, right? And so if they have really good form in how they approach mistakes and how they write about their mistakes, I think they're going to be able to take on harder and harder problems.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate your input.
Oh, absolutely.
Well said, Varghese. And thank you, Jamie, for the great and thought-provoking question. I can actually confirm that we are exploring unit mastery at Khan Academy as we speak. So as I mentioned in the chat a couple times, if you've got a great feature idea for Khan Academy, let us know so we can build that into our roadmap. That being said, let me go over to Jane now, who had raised her hand originally. Jane, if you're still there, feel free to ask a question live to Varghese. Jane, are you there? Okay, I feel like an education talk radio host, so I think we'll cut away from Jane for now. We'll come back if she's ready. Okay, so a couple more questions for Varghese, if you've got the time.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, wonderful. So Joel says, are the paper tests that you alluded to created using screen clips from the Khan Academy problem sets, or are you drawing from some kind of bank of questions like AP Classroom does?
No, I'm actually taking screenshots from the most missed problems that the students have. And even when I was presenting and practicing this presentation to my students, it just clicked for a couple of them that what I do is I look at those reports and I'm curating them and I'm finding different questions so that we have a deep understanding of all the material. But that's all you do. You take a quick screenshot and you add it to an assessment, and it's fun, right? It's fun to see which problems you choose, or at least fun for a geeky math nerd like me to choose particular questions that assess understanding and hold a whole gamut, will affect all of my students. Creating a couple paper quizzes aren't that all that hard. So if some kids take a quiz on Tuesday, usually I don't grade it that week so that I can still have the same quiz a couple days later, but I could also create these paper quizzes quite quickly. And so this allows me to give them different paper quizzes without the fear of cheating or worrying about that. Sorry, I missed something else about that. That's primarily the
yeah, I think that covers it. Then there's a great question from Jeff, and this is sort of digging into how mastery learning works on Khan Academy. So sorry to put you on the spot here, Varghese, but I think better to hear from you directly. You know, Jeff says, if students work on mastery challenges in Algebra 1, will Khan Academy's algorithms notice their arithmetic skills and take them back to arithmetic if they need to practice more? Or is it up to me as a teacher to assign things from earlier math courses to fill in those foundations?
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it will only affect the Algebra 1 skills that they have. It won't, and some of that is overlap, but it won't shoot them back to arithmetic. And again, that's like AI in a couple of years, I'm sure. But right now, you just got to sort of be aware of which gaps they have in the mastery challenges and in the units, and then go back. A lot of the units, you can see threads of them in prior years, right? So 6th grade, you have functions, or at least the inkling of functions, even though they'll see that in 7th, 8th, and pre-algebra and algebra. So again, threading that back is kind of on you at the moment.
Yeah, but we are working on that, Jeff, and I'll mention 2 things that are in place today. So the first thing we have is something called Spiral Review, which basically allows, within the context of a course mastery course, for your students to get spaced repetition. So maybe they've mastered the core foundations, they moved on to the next topic. It'll come back and sort of reassess those same skills over and over again, because we know from learning psychology that the more sort of repetitions you get over time, the more you really lock in that knowledge gain. And then the second thing is just this summer, we built out these new courses called Get Ready for Grade Level. And so they do try to sum up a lot of the key foundational skills for 6th grade math or algebra, so you can get your students up to speed versus going back all the way to kindergarten like Tim Vandenberg did. So I don't know if you have thoughts about those, Varghese.
No, I'll echo that wholeheartedly. So again, I'm teaching this Honors Algebra 2 course, but really what we did was we started by a review of Algebra 1 units, and then I threw in that Getting Ready for Algebra 2 course, right, in for my students. And again, what I told my students is they don't necessarily need to finish that and get a 90%, although they will earn a Khan Academy mask if they do. We went out and got some Khan Academy masks. But the idea is that those getting readies are excellent, especially as I look in future years for placement, right? If the student is wondering if they're ready for a course, then they can take on that getting ready at any point, especially for us who we have this extended winter break because we're trying to keep everybody away during the flu season. And so what I've told my students is, hey, anything that you do helps. So just let me know what you're doing and I'll supplement your work.
Awesome. And Martha says she's a big fan of the Get Ready courses. So definitely check those out if you haven't. They're there in that course menu at the very top of your Khan navigation bar. Okay, let's finish with one final question that kind of takes us back to where we started in terms of questions around grades and expectations. Lindsay says, you talked about that 90% equals 80% framework for your report cards. Lindsay says her administrators think that meeting expectations should get 100%, but I think meeting expectations should be a B. How should Lindsay finesse that question with her administration?
Okay, so meeting expectations digitally gets you to that B, and now that the extra 10% in both paper quizzes. So my students have to get good at communicating their math understanding on paper, right? And maybe everything transitions in 5 years, but right now, they need to be able to communicate their understanding and hold all their ideas on a piece of paper. And so meeting expectations, the rote portion, I think absolutely gets you to a B, Lindsay. But now you could explain to your administrators, they've got to be able to communicate their understanding and prove that they're doing work over time. And so those two pieces, and essentially, even if you're earning half of the points on both of those, you're going to end up with an A-. And so I think that is sort of my solution this year to ensure that my students don't fall apart based on this wild new structure that I've created. But I think it'll also work for you.
Very cool. Well, I will echo what John says in the chat, which is thank you, Tall Man Tutor. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Varghese, who has been super generous to share his expertise and all of his hard-earned insights. And I know he's going to continue to do that on Twitter and through email if you're interested. But that being said, I want to thank more than 100 teachers who stuck with us throughout the entire session to ask these great questions today. And a special shout out to Varghese, who went overtime to answer those questions and share what he's learned. Thank you all so much. And here's wishing you well as we head into the final month of the year. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Jeremy.